My fiancée and her parents publicly mocked my late mother at rehearsal dinner. So, I called off the wedding in front of all without a second thought. There's a particular kind of silence that only happens when a room full of people realizes something has gone terribly off script. It's not just quiet, it's electric, charged with confusion, discomfort, and the sharp edge of something breaking. I remember that silence vividly, because I caused it. I had just pushed back my chair, the legs scraping against the tile floor with a sound far too loud for a fine dining restaurant, and stood up, my fists clenched under the tablecloth moments before, my pulse loud in my ears, my throat burning from the words I'd held back all evening. I didn't plan on saying anything that night. I certainly didn't plan on ending my engagement in front of 60 guests, many of whom I barely knew, some of whom, I realized, never really knew me at all. But there I was, standing under the chandelier light, looking out across a room that was supposed to be celebrating love, and all I could feel was grief. Grief for my mother, who wasn't there to see me marry. Grief for the man I had been trying so hard to be, agreeable, adaptable, quiet. And grief for the relationship I thought I had, now crumbling beneath the weight of something so cruel and so deeply personal that I couldn't ignore it anymore. They had laughed at her. My fiancé's parents, people who owed my mother more than they would ever admit, had stood up in front of a microphone and made her the punchline of their polished, pre-rehearsed speeches. They called her intense, overly helpful, a little too eager to get involved, their voices dipped in faux charm, their eyes scanning the room for chuckles, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that they were dismantling the memory of the woman who had once paid their mortgage when the bank wouldn't. My mother had helped them, loved them, believed in them when no one else did. And now they were turning her legacy into a party anecdote. And the woman I was supposed to marry? She smiled. She smiled and said, "Oh Dad, stop," like it was nothing more than another one of his harmless stories, like this moment wasn't rewiring my entire understanding of who she really was. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She didn't look over at me once, not when they joked about how Michael's mom couldn't help but meddle, not when they raised a glass to keeping her spirit alive, just maybe with less interference. No glance, no discomfort, no attempt to soften the blow. I think there's a moment in every person's life when they realize the cost of silence. For me, that moment happened with my hands trembling by my side, my voice unsure but rising, my heart breaking in a room full of applause that had died mid-clap. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. But I said what needed to be said. And I said it for her. For my mom. For the woman who taught me that dignity matters, that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that sometimes, when people show you who they are, you stand up, even if your knees shake, and you walk out, even if your future is standing beside you, begging you to stay. That's how this story ends. But to truly understand it, you need to know how it began. Because I didn't walk into that restaurant ready to leave a relationship. I walked in thinking I was building a life. And somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing the person I was becoming just to make that life possible. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to the day I met her. Before the red flags, before the silence, before the laughter that tore something open in me I couldn't ignore anymore. We met on a rainy Tuesday in Vancouver, the kind of rain that lingers all day without apology, soaking through your coat and your patience. I was running late to a networking event my boss had begged me to attend. It was one of those industry mixers where engineers like me awkwardly sip watered-down wine and pretend we enjoy talking about concrete stress testing over canapes. I almost turned around at the door. But then she walked in. Her name was Grace. She worked in digital strategy, confident, sharp-witted, the kind of person who makes small talk feel like a private joke. She had this effortless way of filling a space with energy, like a current humming under the surface of her words. I remember she was wearing a forest green coat, damp at the shoulders, her hair curled just slightly from the drizzle. We started talking because she made fun of the salmon tartare. We kept talking because she made everything feel lighter. Falling in love with her didn't feel dramatic or cinematic. It felt natural, like finding the missing half of a sentence I didn't know was incomplete. We fit. Our humor aligned, our silences were comfortable, and she seemed to genuinely care about who I was beyond my job title or salary. I introduced her to my friends, my dad, and eventually, to my mom. I remember how Mom smiled afterward and said, "She's clever. You'll need someone who can keep up with you." Back then, I thought it was a blessing. The first year was like most good beginnings, dinners that turned into long walks, lazy Sundays spent building IKEA furniture and pretending we didn't need the manual. We fought about small things, who left dishes in the sink, how loud her podcast was when I was trying to sleep. But none of it felt serious. Every disagreement ended with an apology and a kiss on the forehead. It felt healthy. It felt real. And slowly, the real stuff started to surface. The differences. The silences that didn't feel quite so comforting. The way she changed when we were around her family. Her parents lived just outside the city, in a sprawling modern house with glass walls and a wine cellar. Her dad ran a chain of high-end design firms. Her mom spent most of her time planning charity galas and silently judging everyone who wore off-brand shoes. They weren't cruel. Not exactly. But from the very beginning, there was this subtle undercurrent, a quiet disapproval that wrapped itself in politeness and condescension. They always smiled when they spoke to me, but it was the kind of smile you give to someone serving hors d'oeuvres, not someone marrying your daughter. Still, I let it go. I told myself love was between two people, not their families. And besides, Grace never said anything hurtful. She'd roll her eyes at her mom's remarks, squeeze my hand under the table, laugh it off. "They're just old-fashioned," she'd say. "They'll come around." And I believed her. Or maybe, I wanted to believe her badly enough to ignore how it made me feel. Looking back, I see the cracks now. Not in her, necessarily, but in me. The way I started to shrink, just a little, whenever we visited her parents. How I stopped mentioning my mom around them because it always led to eye rolls or comments about boundary issues. How I let Grace talk me out of including a small tribute to my mom at our wedding ceremony because it's supposed to be about us, not grief. At the time, I told myself it was compromise. Now I know it was self-erasure. It's strange how love can blur your instincts, make you rewrite yourself in softer ink just to keep the page clean. I bent parts of myself to fit into their world. I downplayed where I came from, the woman who raised me, the struggles that shaped me. I stopped telling stories about my childhood, afraid they'd become punchlines over wine. I smiled through dinner parties where I was introduced as the engineer fiancé, so grounded, like I was some quaint, rustic detail in their otherwise curated life. But Grace, she was everything I wasn't. Ambitious, articulate, beautiful in that polished, LinkedIn kind of way. When she walked into a room, people noticed. And I loved that about her. I loved how she pushed herself, how she carried confidence like it was stitched into her skin. I just didn't realize that in her world, I was always going to be the man who had to prove he belonged. There's a quiet kind of loss that happens when you give up small pieces of yourself, one polite silence at a time. And for a long while, I didn't notice how much I was giving away. Until, one day, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man rehearsing wedding vows that no longer felt like they were written from the heart. If you want to understand why that night at the rehearsal dinner cut so deep, you have to know who my mother was, not just to me, but to anyone lucky enough to cross her path. Her name was Diane, and she was the kind of woman who didn't make a scene when she helped someone. She didn't announce her good deeds or keep receipts. She just showed up. Quietly. Consistently. Like the way sunrise shows up after a long night, without asking for thanks. She raised me on her own after my father passed when I was 7. Worked double shifts as a trauma nurse in the emergency wing at St. Joseph's and still made it to every school assembly, every parent-teacher night, every busted bike chain, scraped knee, science fair, and heartbreak I couldn't put into words. Our apartment was small, modest, some might say, but it was warm in the way that homes are when the person running them understands that love lives in the little things. Fresh towels folded with lavender sachets. Notes tucked into lunch bags. Soup waiting on the stove when I came home late from work as an adult and didn't have the strength to pretend I wasn't exhausted. Diane didn't just love me. She believed in me, even on the days I didn't believe in myself. She never pushed, never judged. Just listened. She had a way of making you feel like your pain wasn't a burden but a language she understood fluently. And that, I think, was her greatest gift, her ability to meet people where they were, without needing them to be anyone other than who they truly were. That's what she did for Grace's family, too. Long before the engagement, before anyone ever passed around champagne or talked about color palettes and floral budgets, my mother had already poured herself into the lives of the woman I loved and the people who raised her. Grace's family had been struggling. Her father's architecture firm had just lost its biggest client, and her mother, accustomed to a life without financial friction, was suddenly facing things like budgeting, cutting back, and the concept of not replacing the countertops every 2 years. They were proud people, but pride doesn't pay off commercial loans. Their situation was spiraling. Grace told me about it one night over takeout, her voice shaking in that vulnerable way where strength and fear collide. I remember going to my mom the next day, asking her what I could do to help. I was only a few years into my job back then, just starting to save. But Mom didn't hesitate. She didn't lecture me about boundaries. She didn't ask how it might affect our relationship if things went south. She simply nodded and said, "Let's sit down and figure it out." Within 2 weeks, my mother had co-signed a restructuring loan with a private lender who trusted her credit more than theirs. She helped rework their monthly operations budget, cutting unnecessary expenses with the grace of someone who'd managed to feed a child on a nurse's salary for over 2 decades. When Grace's parents' restaurant extension was denied due to code violations, my mom connected them to her own brother, an inspector who walked them through compliance step by step. When their industrial fridge broke in the middle of a heat wave, she paid for the replacement outright, telling me quietly later that good people sometimes need help being steady again. She didn't ask for a thank you. She didn't expect one. But even so, you hope, when someone does something that kind, that selfless, that meaningful, you hope the people on the receiving end will carry that generosity with humility, or at the very least, remember it with decency. But that's not what happened. As time went on, and as Grace and I grew more serious, I started noticing something strange. The way her parents would speak about my mom changed. At first, they simply left her out of conversations. Then came the subtle remarks, "Your mom really likes to insert herself into things, doesn't she?" Or, "She means well, but sometimes she oversteps." They'd say it with a chuckle, a wave of the hand, like it was all just harmless observation. But each time, it landed like a paper cut, small, easy to ignore, but stinging every time it reopened. Grace noticed, I think. But she never said much. She'd change the subject or shrug it off, telling me I was reading too much into it. And because I loved her, and because I wanted this relationship to work so badly, I convinced myself maybe she was right. Maybe it was just generational differences. Maybe my mom was a little too helpful sometimes. Maybe I was being too sensitive. It took me a long time to admit that it wasn't sensitivity. It was clarity. I was watching people who owed everything to a woman act as though she were a nuisance. I was watching them rewrite her story, not with facts, but with tone, with omission, with jokes told too many times and apologies never offered. And Grace? She never defended her. Never said, "That's not fair." Never stood up and reminded them that without Diane, their dining table might be empty, their restaurant shuttered, their savings account a ghost. That silence, it stayed with me. It's one thing for someone to insult your family. It's another for the person you love to sit quietly while it happens. Because silence, despite what we tell ourselves, is never neutral. And deep down, I think I always knew, the people who pretended my mother didn't matter, were never going to treat me like I did. The trouble with subtle disrespect is that it's easy to excuse, at least at first. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't slap you across the face, it brushes past your shoulder with a smirk, pretending not to notice the bruise it leaves behind. And so, for a long time, I told myself that the things Grace's family said or did weren't that serious. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I needed to let it go, to not take things so personally. But what I didn't realize back then is that disrespect doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it builds slowly, grain by grain, like sand filling your shoes, until one day, you can't walk forward without feeling its weight. It started with a joke, at least, that's what they called it. We were at brunch one Sunday, sitting on Grace's parents' patio, drinking mimosas out of glasses too delicate for my clumsy hands. Her dad, Arthur, looked across the table at me and said, "So, Michael, you're from Hamilton, right? That's cute. A working-class background builds character, I hear." He smiled as he said it, sipped his drink like it was nothing, while Grace's mom laughed softly behind her napkin. I laughed too, an awkward, hesitant kind of chuckle, because I didn't know what else to do. Grace didn't say anything. She just looked at me and shrugged, like, "Don't make a scene." After that, the comments kept coming. Her mother, Evelyn, had this way of complimenting Grace that somehow managed to degrade me at the same time. "You've always aimed high, sweetheart," she'd say, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "You've always had such refined taste." Once, after I'd spent the afternoon helping them fix their broken garden irrigation system, she turned to Grace and said, "Well, at least he's handy, if nothing else." Another time, when we were discussing honeymoon ideas, Evelyn blinked at me and said, "Just make sure it's somewhere nice." We wouldn't want Grace sleeping in a motel, now would we? They were always smiling. Always joking. Always just this side of polite. And I kept giving them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they didn't realize how they sounded. Maybe they were just trying to be funny. Maybe. I built a whole narrative of forgiveness around their behavior, like scaffolding around a building that was never going to be finished. Grace's reaction made it harder. She wasn't cruel. She didn't encourage them, not directly. But she also never stopped them. If I brought something up later, she'd dismiss it with that soft, tired tone that always made me feel like a burden. "Babe, you're overthinking. My parents are just a little old school." Or, "Come on, don't let them get to you. They're like this with everyone." But they weren't like this with everyone. They were like this with me. And deep down, I think she knew that. Sometimes the worst part wasn't what they said, it was how Grace laughed along. A small, tight laugh that didn't reach her eyes, but didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of endorsement. And over time, I began to doubt myself, not just my worth, but my perception. Was I really being too sensitive? Was I imagining things? Should I just be grateful to be included in a family that clearly thought I didn't quite belong? I started editing myself, bit by bit. I stopped talking about my hometown, stopped bringing up my mom, stopped suggesting things that I knew Evelyn would mock with her tight-lipped smile and passive-aggressive wit. I learned to anticipate their reactions before they even spoke. I started calculating every sentence in my head before I let it out loud. Once, I tried to suggest a different song for our first dance. Something simple, personal, Harvest Moon by Neil Young. It was one of my mom's favorites, and she used to hum it in the kitchen when I was a kid. Grace smiled at me gently and said, "It's a bit dated, don't you think?" Her mother chimed in from across the room, "Yes, dear, it's your wedding, not a retirement party." They laughed. I didn't. You'd be amazed how easy it is to mistake shrinking for adapting. I thought I was compromising. I thought I was being mature. I thought I was making things easier for everyone. But what I was really doing was disappearing, one concession at a time. And the thing is, no single comment broke me. No one dinner ruined the relationship. But that's how erosion works, isn't it? It's not one wave that wears down the rock. It's the unrelenting tide, the constant push and pull, the slow stealing away of what once felt solid. By the time the rehearsal dinner came around, I'd already stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. I still wore the same suits, still smiled in the same photos, still stood beside the same woman I loved. But I was tired. Tired of laughing when something wasn't funny. Tired of swallowing pride that should never have been questioned. Tired of holding space for a family that never once made room for mine. And I didn't know it yet, but that night would be the last time I ever pretended I didn't notice the mountain of little insults they'd spent years quietly building, stone by stone, joke by joke, silence by silence. The night of the rehearsal dinner, the sky over Vancouver was a pale, unconvincing kind of blue, the kind that looks like it's holding back a storm. I remember staring at it from the passenger seat as Grace drove, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel, her eyes on the road but her mind clearly elsewhere. We barely spoke on the way there. She answered a few emails. I stared out the window. The silence between us wasn't cold exactly, but it was no longer the kind that feels comfortable. It was the kind that hums just under the skin, restless and unresolved. The restaurant her parents had chosen sat on the waterfront, a converted yacht club with tall glass walls and staff who seemed trained to smile without blinking. It was the kind of place you book when you're not just trying to host an event, but trying to prove something while doing it. Arthur and Evelyn had arranged everything, down to the place cards, the menu, the music. Grace and I had offered to help, but they insisted. "We want this to be special," Evelyn said over the phone, her voice wrapped in silk. "It's a gift." But gifts, I've learned, are sometimes just expectations in disguise. When we walked in, I knew something was off almost immediately. The room was beautiful, yes, lit by hanging bulbs that glowed like fireflies in jars, the tables covered in crisp linen and glassware that caught the light like crystal. But it was who was in the room, and who wasn't, that gave me pause. Nearly every seat was filled by Grace's family, their friends, her father's clients, people who'd known her since she was 5. On my side? Just my dad, my sister, and 2 close friends I'd invited weeks ago. No cousins. No uncles. No colleagues from work. It wasn't that they'd forgotten, it was that they hadn't asked. I leaned over to Grace and whispered, "Where's the rest of my family? You said there would be room." She didn't look up from her phone. We had to prioritize people who RSVP'd early. My parents didn't want the space to feel half empty. Half empty. That's what I was, standing there in a room full of strangers clinking glasses, smiling tightly, making small talk about golf and market trends. Grace moved through the crowd effortlessly. She was in her element, laughing at the right moments, hugging people she hadn't seen in years, introducing me like a footnote. "This is Michael, my fiancé," she'd say, then pivot back to the person she actually wanted to talk to. I didn't blame her. Not really. It just stung. Dinner came and went. The food was exquisite. No one could deny that. Filet mignon carved like butter, wine poured before your glass even looked empty. But the warmth? The joy? That was missing. It felt less like a pre-wedding celebration and more like a corporate dinner disguised in romance-colored lighting. And then came the speeches. Arthur went first. He stood up, cleared his throat, and smiled like a man stepping into the spotlight he believed he'd earned. His voice carried, booming and clear, and as he began, I braced myself, hoping for grace and preparing for damage. "Tonight is about family," he said. "About unity, legacy, and love. So far, so good. We're so proud of our daughter. She's always been exceptional, sharp, driven, kind, and we're thrilled she's found someone who keeps her grounded." Laughter rippled through the room. My jaw tightened. I felt my sister shift in her seat beside me. "She's always reached high," he continued, "always had a vision for her life. And while Michael may not have been what we first pictured," he paused, smiling at me with something that wasn't quite kindness, "we've come to see his value." I could feel my father watching him, face unreadable. I tried to smile. I failed. Next came Evelyn. She stood with practiced elegance, holding her glass like an accessory, not a drink. "When I first met Michael," she began, "I thought, well, Grace has always loved a challenge." Laughter again. Nervous this time. She glanced at me and smiled. "But really, Michael brings something special. He's humble. Grounded. He even fixed our sink once. Quite handy." More laughter. I didn't join in. Then she said it, we've had to adjust, of course. Michael comes from a different kind of background. But love, she paused for effect, is all about compromise. I stared at Grace, waiting for her to say something, to intervene, to show even a flicker of discomfort. But she was smiling. Not forced. Not fake. Just, smiling. And then Arthur stood again. There's one more person I want to mention, he said, raising his glass. Diane. Michael's mother. Though she's no longer with us, her energy lives on. For a moment, my heart swelled, relief, maybe, or hope. But then he added, she was certainly involved. Always had an opinion. Always knew best. Even when no one asked. He chuckled. Evelyn joined in. She meant well, she said. Very assertive, that woman. Assertive, Arthur echoed. And generous, I'll give her that. She helped us when we needed it. Sometimes too much. But hey, that's family, right? The room was quiet now. Not awkward. Worse. Complacent. Like no one wanted to be the one to say it had gone too far. I looked at Grace again. She didn't flinch. Didn't frown. Didn't object. She just reached for her wine and sipped it, as if they hadn't just reduced the most important woman in my life to a caricature of herself, a meddler, a punchline. And that was the moment. Not when they insulted me. Not when they erased half of my family from the guest list. Not even when they turned our rehearsal dinner into a stage for their pride. It was that look on Grace's face. That absence of outrage. That quiet approval in her silence. Because when people show you who they are, it's not always with cruelty. Sometimes it's with indifference. And that indifference? That night? Broke something I couldn't put back together. At first, I didn't even realize I was standing. I just remember the chair pushing back, the sudden scrape of wood on tile cutting through the clink of silverware, and the way every head in the room seemed to swivel toward me like a flock of birds sensing a shift in wind. For a moment, no one said a word. Arthur was still holding his glass midair, Evelyn frozen mid-sip, and Grace just blinked at me, her lips parted slightly, as if she wasn't quite sure what she was seeing. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't angry. Not in the shouting, red-faced way people expect. I was something colder. Something sharper. Like glass just before it cracks. Are you serious right now? I said, quietly at first. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't premeditated. It was a truth that had clawed its way to the surface and refused to be swallowed any longer. You stood here and turned my mother into a joke. A woman who helped you, who saved your business, who gave more than she ever got, and you mocked her. And you expect me to just sit here and smile through it? There was a pause. A long, stunned, collective pause. Then Arthur leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and gave me the kind of look a man gives a child who's throwing a tantrum. You're overreacting, he said, his voice calm in the most patronizing way imaginable. It was just a little humor. Lighten up. Lighten up. I felt my fists clench, not in violence, but in restraint. Calling her too much. Saying she gave too much. That's not humor. That's rewriting history because you're uncomfortable with how much you owe her. Evelyn's laugh was quiet, airy, the kind of laugh that tells you she thinks you're being dramatic. Michael, don't be so sensitive. We were just reminiscing. No, I said, shaking my head. You were reframing her kindness as interference. You were turning generosity into something shameful. And Grace, I looked at her, and this time she did flinch, you just sat there. You didn't stop them. You didn't say a word. She looked away. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, the discomfort, the whispers starting to form at the edges. But I didn't care. Something had broken open, and now there was no putting it back. Arthur stood then, probably to reassert control. If you're that upset, Michael, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the exit, maybe you should step outside. So I did. I turned, walked past the shocked faces and carefully arranged centerpieces, through the double glass doors and out into the cool night air. The wind hit my face like truth. Clean. Sharp. Honest. My father followed me out a moment later. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me, the way fathers do when they know what's needed isn't advice, it's presence. My sister came next, her arms folded, her face tight with fury. You were right, she said simply. And for a minute, we just stood there. I could hear the low hum of the city behind us, the muted laughter of people inside pretending everything was still okay. But out here, it was quiet. I can't marry into that, I said, finally. My father nodded. You don't have to. But even as I said it, even as the decision crystallized in my chest, something unsettled me. I realized that if I walked away now, if I left without saying anything more, they would own the story. They would spin it. Reframe it. Tell people I was unstable, emotional, that I ruined the evening over a misunderstood joke. They would bury my mother a second time, this time with smug smiles and social grace. And that? I couldn't let happen. I need to go back in there, I said. My sister turned to me sharply. Why? You don't owe them anything. I know, I replied. But I owe it to her. Neither of them tried to stop me. So I turned, pulled the door open, and stepped back into the room I had just walked out of. The chatter dimmed again. Forks froze. Eyes tracked me like I was a ghost re-entering his own funeral. Grace was standing now, her expression unreadable. Arthur and Evelyn looked confused, maybe a little smug, like they thought I'd come back to apologize. They had no idea. I walked to the center of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pound the table. I just spoke. Clearly. Calmly. Like someone finally stepping into the truth they'd been running from. Excuse me, everyone, I said. I know this isn't the moment anyone expected for this, but after what just happened tonight, I don't see any reason to wait. Grace started moving toward me, but I held up a hand. This wedding is off. Gasps. The sharp scrape of a chair. The breath in the room got caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. I know that sounds sudden, I continued, but the truth is, it's been building. Tonight just made it impossible to ignore. I can't marry into a family that disrespects my past. That disrespects my mother. That thinks kindness is something to be mocked. I turned to Arthur. You think you're the one making sacrifices. But the real sacrifice would be me staying silent and letting this version of events stand. Then I looked at Grace, really looked at her. Her eyes were glistening, her hands trembling slightly. I loved you, I said, softly. But I can't love someone who won't stand up for me. Or for the person who made me who I am. She opened her mouth. Closed it again. There was nothing left to say. I walked out a second time, but this time, it wasn't in pain. It was in peace. It had been 3 days since the dinner. 3 days since I stood in that room full of curated charm and delivered what some would call a scene, and what I now know was simply the truth. The fallout was fast and relentless. My phone lit up with messages like a switchboard on fire, texts from Grace, long paragraphs of explanation and apology, alternating between remorse and confusion. Voicemails from Evelyn, all high-pitched shock and passive-aggressive sorrow. One from Arthur, blunt and dismissive, you embarrassed yourself. You'll regret it. But I didn't. Not for a second. What I felt was something quieter, heavier, like the aftermath of a storm when the roof's gone but the rain has finally stopped. I was exhausted, yes. But also clearer than I'd been in months. Maybe years. I tried to avoid my apartment the day after. I didn't want to sit among the wedding plans, the stack of RSVP cards still on the kitchen counter, or the tuxedo still hanging in the closet like a ghost with nowhere left to go. But eventually, life requires you to return to your space, even when that space no longer fits who you are. So I came home. And out of habit, I walked to the hallway cabinet where I kept a small wooden box, dark mahogany, with tiny brass hinges that clicked softly when you opened it. My mother's box. Her keepsake. Inside were the only things I had left that carried her scent, her touch, her story. A pair of her pearl earrings. Her old hospital ID badge. And nestled at the center, wrapped in a faded silk handkerchief, was the locket. It was small. Simple. Silver, with a tiny, hand-carved flower pressed into its surface. Inside was a photo of my grandmother on one side and my mother, smiling, hair pulled back in a bun, wearing her nurse's scrubs, on the other. That locket had been passed down through 3 generations. And before she died, my mother handed it to me. One day, she'd said, her voice already thin from the chemo, "You'll know who this belongs to. Not because you're supposed to give it away, but because it will feel right. You'll trust her. You'll know she'll protect it." I hadn't given it to Grace. Not yet. I'd thought about it, once, months ago. But something in me, some quiet, unnameable instinct, told me to wait. So imagine my confusion when I opened the box and found it empty. At first, I thought it had slipped into a corner. I removed every piece of cloth, every item, checked beneath the velvet lining. I rechecked the drawer. The cabinet. The floors around it. Panic hit like a drop in blood pressure, sudden, dizzying. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I'd moved it. Maybe I'd forgotten. But the truth arrived quickly, quietly, like it always does when you stop pretending. The only person who had been in that apartment since the dinner was Grace. She'd come by to return the engagement ring. I didn't let her in past the hallway, but I'd stepped into the kitchen for a moment. She'd asked to use the bathroom. I'd said yes without thinking. And the box wasn't locked. It never had to be. I sat down. Hands trembling, I picked up my phone and texted her. "Did you take the locket from the box?" Minutes passed. Then came the reply. "What locket?" I felt something cold settle in my chest. "The one my mom gave me. It's missing. You're the only person who's been here." This time, it took longer. Then her message buzzed through. "I didn't take it. I borrowed it. I just wanted something that reminded me of you. I was going to give it back." Borrowed. She used the word like it was harmless. Like taking something sacred without asking was no different than picking up a book from my shelf or a hoodie from my chair. I called her. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was low, thin, already on the edge of tears. "Michael, please. I didn't mean to upset you. I needed something of hers. Something of yours. I didn't think you'd notice." "Of course I noticed," I said, my voice tight, trembling not from volume but from how hard I was trying not to explode. "You didn't think I'd notice that the one thing I've kept safe since the day she died was gone? I didn't steal it." "Yes, you did," I snapped. "You stole it. You knew what it meant to me. You knew it wasn't yours to touch, let alone take. And you didn't even ask." She started crying then. I could hear it, ragged, choked sobs that might have been real, but I was past the point of interpreting intention. "I only cared about one thing." "Where is it?" I demanded. "It's at my parents' house," she said. "I didn't want to lose it, so I kept it safe there." That was the moment something inside me cracked, not with rage, but with finality. It wasn't just the speeches. It wasn't just the laughter. It was this casual violation of something sacred. This belief that her desire to feel close to me was more important than my right to grieve the woman who made me who I am. "I'm coming to get it," I said, and hung up. 35 minutes later, I was standing at her parents' front door. Evelyn opened it. Her smile faltered the moment she saw my face. "Michael," she began, but I brushed past her. Grace appeared at the top of the stairs, holding the locket in her hand. She looked smaller than I remembered. Fragile. Almost childlike. She stepped forward, extended her hand. "Here," she whispered. I took it. I didn't say thank you. I opened it. Checked the pictures. Ran my thumb over the surface. Then I looked at her. "You took something that didn't belong to you. Something I can't replace. And now I know, whatever version of love we had, it didn't come with respect." She said nothing. I turned, walked out, and this time I didn't look back. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after you've made a decision you can't take back. It's not relief, not at first. It's more like standing in the middle of an empty house after the movers have gone, the echo of what once was, mingling with the uncertainty of what comes next. That's what it felt like in the days after I walked out of Grace's life for good. I didn't post about it. I didn't text her back. I didn't explain myself to anyone outside my family and the few friends who'd seen the storm up close. I didn't need to. I wasn't angry anymore, not the raw, burning kind that boils in your gut and demands to be heard. No, what I felt was something more sober. More enduring. It was the calm that follows a fire, not because nothing mattered, but because now I could see clearly what had survived the flames. I thought about calling her, once or twice. Not to reconcile. Not even to argue. Just to ask her a single question: why? Why did you let them talk about my mother like that? Why did you smile when they reduced her life to a punchline? Why didn't you stop them, or at the very least, look me in the eyes and tell me you were sorry? But I already knew the answer. She didn't say anything because it was easier not to. She didn't stop them because deep down, she didn't see it as wrong. And when someone doesn't see your pain as real, they're not capable of protecting it. So I started rebuilding. Quietly. Slowly. Without her. The first thing I did was pack up everything that reminded me of the wedding, the RSVP cards, the guest list, the tuxedo I never wore. I took the locket, now safely back in my mother's box, and wrapped it in a fresh linen cloth, then placed it in the center of my bedroom drawer. I didn't want to hide it away again, as if it were something fragile I had to protect from the world. No. I wanted to see it every morning, to remind myself that love, real love, is rooted in respect. That the past matters, and the people who shaped us don't stop mattering just because someone else finds them inconvenient. Then, I wrote a letter. Not to Grace. Not to her parents. But to myself. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't elegant. But it was honest. It said, "Never forget that silence is not strength when it protects cruelty. Never forget that love without loyalty is a performance. And never again shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's approval." I taped that letter to the inside of my closet door. I read it every morning for a month. And gradually, things got better. I went back to work. My team didn't ask questions. They just handed me blueprints and let me get lost in the math. My father called more. My sister visited, unprompted, bringing over lasagna and movies we'd watched as kids. The life I thought would be shattered without Grace didn't collapse. It adjusted. It reoriented around something sturdier. Something I could trust. And I started going on walks. Not for any reason. Not to clear my head or reach a destination. Just to remind myself that movement still existed. That even when something ends, your feet still know how to keep going. One evening, a few weeks later, I passed by a couple walking hand in hand under a string of cafe lights. They were laughing, freely, fully, without irony. And for a split second, I felt the weight of what I had lost. Not just the relationship, but the idea of it. The version of life I'd built in my head, where love meant safety, family, a place to belong. But then I realized something. I didn't lose that. I just stopped pretending I had it. Because if someone asks you to abandon the people who made you who you are, if they ask you to stay quiet when your integrity is on the line, If they stand by while others humiliate the people you love. That's not a family. That's a stage. And you're just another character in their script. I chose to step off that stage. And in doing so, I found something I never expected, a version of myself who didn't need applause to know he mattered. That's the thing about betrayal. It always feels like destruction at first. But sometimes, it's just the clearing you needed to finally start building something real. Grief is strange. People treat it like a season, something you're supposed to move through with predictable weather patterns. First the storm, then the drizzle, and eventually, clear skies. But in my experience, grief isn't linear. It's circular. It loops back when you least expect it, when you hear a song your mother used to hum while folding laundry, or when you're standing in a grocery aisle and see her favorite brand of tea. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a tug. A quiet ache behind the ribs that reminds you, someone who mattered deeply is no longer here. What I learned, though, is that grief becomes unbearable not because of its weight, but because of the way the world tries to rush you through it. Tries to clean it up. Package it. Explain it away. That's what Grace did. That's what her family did. They treated my grief like it was an inconvenience. An old bruise I should have already stopped touching. But grief, real grief, is not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry. It becomes part of your rhythm. And anyone who can't respect that rhythm doesn't deserve to dance beside you. I used to think respect was about politeness. About holding doors open and saying thank you. But after everything, I know now, respect is about how people hold space for your story. It's how they talk about the ones you love when you're not in the room. It's the way they react when you say, "This matters to me," and they either lean in or look away. Respect isn't words. It's reflex. It's whether someone protects what's sacred to you, even when they don't understand it. That locket didn't just symbolize my mother, it held a piece of my identity. And the moment Grace slipped it into her purse without asking, she told me everything I needed to know, that her comfort came before my history. That her version of closeness came at the cost of boundaries. That love, for her, was something you held onto even if it meant crossing lines you had no right to cross. I don't tell this story for revenge. I'm not here to make Grace the villain or her parents the enemy. They are who they are. And I've come to accept that not everyone will treat you the way you treat them, not everyone will meet your vulnerability with reverence. But I tell this story because someone needs to hear that choosing peace over guilt is not abandonment. It's alignment. I could have stayed. I could have laughed off the speeches, brushed away the comments, forgiven the theft as some misguided act of sentimentality. I could have told myself that love means compromise, even when that compromise erodes the foundation you stand on. But then I'd be living a life where silence costs more than truth. Instead, I chose something else. I chose peace. Not the kind that comes wrapped in perfection, but the kind you build slowly, intentionally, like a house that doesn't need chandeliers to feel like home. A peace rooted in knowing that love without respect isn't love. That grief deserves gentleness, not mockery. And that sometimes, walking away isn't failure. It's freedom. There are still moments when it hurts. There are days when I think about what might have been, what that wedding might have looked like, what our life might have become. But then I remember the way it felt to stand up in that room, heart pounding, spine straight, speaking the truth even though my voice trembled. And I realize, that was the beginning of me becoming the kind of man my mother would be proud of. Not the man who got everything right. But the one who finally remembered where he came from, and decided never again to apologize for it. I've asked myself this question more times than I can count, quietly, in the middle of the night, while brushing my teeth, folding laundry, or waiting for the coffee to brew. What would have happened if I had stayed silent? If I had let the jokes slide, let the speeches pass, nodded through the humiliation and told myself peace was worth more than pride, that silence was simpler than confrontation? Would we have gone through with the wedding? Would we be living together now, smiling in photos, celebrating anniversaries built on years of pretending? I think about the version of myself that might have existed if I'd chosen the easier path, and I don't recognize him. Because the truth is, every time you stay silent in the face of disrespect, you give away a piece of yourself. Not all at once, but slowly. Gradually. Like water dripping on stone. And one day, you wake up and realize you've carved yourself into someone smaller, more agreeable, more acceptable, but less whole. That night at the rehearsal dinner wasn't just about what they said. It was about what they believed they had the right to say. And even more than that, it was about what they thought I would tolerate. But I didn't stand up just for my mom. I stood up for the man she raised, the one taught that love and loyalty are inseparable. That respect isn't earned through silence, it's demanded through presence. I could have stayed. I could have explained. I could have compromised until I had nothing left to give. But then I'd be building a life where my boundaries were negotiable and my grief had an expiration date. Instead, I chose to walk away. I chose peace, not the kind that comes from giving in, but the kind you build yourself, brick by honest brick. So now, I ask you, would you have stayed quiet? If it were your mother? If it were your past, your name, your pain turned into someone else's punchline, would you have swallowed it for comfort? Or would you have stood, even if your knees shook, and said, not this time, not anymore? If this story feels like yours, if any part of it made you pause, leave a comment. Share your truth. Or just say, I stood up too. And if you're still finding your voice, still learning to protect your peace, stick around. Subscribe. Because there's strength in starting over. And even more in doing it on your own terms.